energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
You're trying to save for a house deposit, and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money. How on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India, and there's certain key things that they want from us.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to the programme. A bit later on, we're going to talk about the official data which shows that net migration has hit a record high of 745,000 net arrivals in the year to December. Joining us in a few minutes, Madeleine Sumption, who's the director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford.
But first, we're going to discuss if the government is picking a fight with the Bank of England over inflation. Rishi Sunak may have achieved his goal of halving inflation by the end of the year, but there is a warning today about how price pressures are still stubborn. That's the word used by the Bank of England's chief economist. He's been speaking to the FT about this. He says that indicators that the BOE is focusing on, pay growth and services inflation, that's things like restaurants, gym memberships and phone bills, well, he says they remain, quote, at very elevated levels.
Remember, although the government is trumpeting having hit its inflation target, we'll probably hear that time and time again over the coming weeks, no doubt. The Bank of England is a long way from actually hitting its target. Inflation's at 4.6% in the year to October. The Bank of England target's at 2%.
Well, after the autumn statement, the Office for Budget Responsibility said that it expects inflation to linger longer than it did when it last made a forecast back in March. It also warns that the measures set out by the Chancellor will boost demand more than the supply capacity of the economy. Well, let's choose some of this over and some of the political ramifications with Joe Mays from our UK government team. Now, Joe, what's the thinking in government about the inflation risk from the tax cuts we got this week?
Well, I think the thinking is that they think they've done enough in the autumn statement to boost the supply side of the economy, to keep a lid on public spending, to reduce borrowing, such that even if it is perhaps slightly inflationary to be putting more money in people's pockets through the national insurance cut, that the net effect of this fiscal package is broadly neutral. So that's why they think that they can get away with this. But it's a real question, as we've been talking about, for the Bank of England, because that inflationary pressure does feel like it will have to come through because of that effect. And so they're going to have to be on guard. So we are potentially, yes, moving towards a situation where fiscal policy, monetary policy, perhaps moving in different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, for what people actually feel in their wallets most acutely, I mean, food price inflation is well above that number for overall inflation. So that's kind of quite difficult. I mean, the government at the moment seems quite in love with the idea of 5 goals. I mean, almost every minister seems to have 5 goals. Are they believing their own hype when it comes to halving inflation by the end of the year? That was the goal that was achieved. I mean, are they taking risks now by sort of having championed beating inflation in some senses?
I think it is taking a slight risk, but from the political perspective, that's what's trumping now. It's kind of doing what you can to go into an election with a positive narrative that voters might try to buy into, and that would speak to why tax cuts are potentially a good idea at this point. And so you can see how the political imperatives and the economic imperatives are starting to separate now, especially as we get closer to the election, and the Conservative Party is prioritising the politics. So it's going to get increasingly tense, I think, because of these dynamics, and the Conservative Party just has to hope that inflation doesn't pick up in a way that the Bank of England has to respond to through either keeping interest rates higher for longer or indeed going back into a cycle of raising rates. They really don't want to see that. So it's a real balancing act for both sides.
The forecasts are that inflation is not going to come down to the Bank of England's targets anytime soon. What are the dangers for the government if there's an uptick in inflation? How much of a political problem is this still for the government?
I think it is still a pretty strong one. And if that inflation effect is seen and the Bank of England either responds with higher rates or keep them higher for longer, it simply means that we'll go into an election year where people will still be feeling the pain, especially on their mortgages, for example, and growth. The reason why the OBR this week brought those growth forecasts down was largely because of the effects of those higher interest rates, because that dampens economic activity, and that's why it weighs on the overall size of the economy going forward. So, and the other thing that Rishi Sunak and Hunt have to be careful of is future downgrades to growth forecasts, which mean that their fiscal headroom they used in this most recent autumn statement disappears, and then they're in an even worse position in the spring budget and have to unwind some of these tax cuts. So it's still really quite a fraught position.
Yeah, I mean, I had to delve into the numbers on this to understand exactly this year where the UK's tax take is coming from. I mean, it's still coming from the big three, which is income tax, the payroll tax, which is national insurance, and VAT. Business taxes make up about 11% of the tax take. We're now a couple of days on from the autumn statement. People have had a bit more time to unpack all of this. I mean, the government delivered in some senses what a lot of Tories wanted, which was a big tax cut, i.e. to national insurance. It's one of the big three, as I say. So how did it actually go down amongst Tories, do you think, Joe?
I think amongst MPs, it went down pretty well. I think there was a view that this is taking steps in the right direction. It's something they could sell on the doorstep. More money for you, about £440 in the new year for an average worker because of the next cut. I think MPs were broadly happy. I think, but more widely speaking, we had all the criticisms that we heard about how the tax burden is still going up in this parliament, and indeed living standards will fall for the first time between general elections under this Conservative government. So, there were things for the Tory MPs to be happy about, but that bigger picture was still pretty weak, and that's something that the government has to contend with.
Joe, I'm keen to get your take on how Labour feel about the autumn statement. Is there a sense that the Chancellor's boxed them into supporting two quite expensive tax cuts? The business tax cut in particular is a lot of money, leaving them with even less money to play with should they form a government?
Yes, I mean, the key premise in the autumn statement is this, quite significant decrease in public spending in real terms into the future. And that's something that if Labour came in, they would have to, you'd think, want to reverse some of that, but that might mean having to put taxes back up, finding ways to pay for it. Now, crucially, at this point, Labour is not playing the game, so to speak. They're saying, we're not going to fall into the trap of engaging with this setup that you've made for us. We're not going to talk about it before an election, for sure. I mean, obviously, after the election, if they do win, they'll have to come to terms with it. But yeah, they're trying to avoid playing into these traps.
Yeah, absolutely. Meanwhile, the speculation about actually when that general election happens, what looks likely? What's the playbook there?
So there's increasing talk about whether the election might actually be in May. I think that the kind of consensus view prior to the autumn statement and in the last few weeks was that the election would come in the autumn, giving Rishi Sunak time. But now the view is that given that the payroll tax cut, the national insurance tax cut is coming in January, that's a fast track to move. And you've also got the fact that the budget might happen earlier this year. Jeremy Hunt did not rule out that as a prospect. So all those signs together make us think, maybe the Conservative Party is going to go earlier and then perhaps, cut more taxes in the spring and then off the wave of optimism that produces, hold the election. That's the latest view. But, it's still not clear. It's still something that could go either way, but Westminster is certainly kind of at fever pitch on this question.
Yeah, absolutely, about when that next general election will be. Joe, stay right there because that's the sort of conclusion around the autumn statement. But we did also hear a bit more about tax cuts and whether or not they were the right ones. And so we've been discussing this with the tax guru. I will call him a tax guru. I think that is fair.
Probably
Dan
fair.
Neidle. Yeah. He's the founder of Tax Policy Associates. And I think he's probably become one of the loudest voices when it comes to analysis of the tax picture here in the UK. He gave us an interview just earlier this morning on Bloomberg Radio talking about how disappointed he was by the autumn statement and all of the tax implications that it had. Have a listen.
So there's always lots of political noise about the top rate of tax, 45 pence. Should it be higher? Should it be lower? 45 pence is not the highest rate of tax in the UK. The various weirdnesses in the tax system mean there are people earning £50,000 paying a marginal rate of tax of 80%. Because of the way student loan repayment works, because of the way child benefit is clawed back. 80%. How can we have a Conservative Chancellor presiding over an economy with a top marginal rate of tax of 80%? It's madness. And people respond to this rationally by controlling their hours, turning away work, even refusing promotions to avoid hitting the £50,000 mark. And there's a similar, and sometimes even bigger effect at £100,000. And I know many people who have, again, turned away work, controlled their hours to not hit the £100,000 point, because in some cases that can actually cost you money. And these are deep problems with the tax system that a chancellor who's interested in growth and productivity should be focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen you make this point about the sort of £50,000 to £60,000 camp, but also the camp, quite significantly higher on £100,000 to £120,000. I mean, I suppose the question is why the Chancellor is not addressing those, and also whether there is simply an issue with the yo-yoing, as the Labour Party put it, the yo-yoing of taxes here in the UK, the kind of rate of change that the UK's tax system actually sees. Is that problematic to you?
I mean, for business tax, it is absolutely a problem. You can plan a business investment based on pretty much any rate of tax, any tax system. What you cannot plan for is constant change. And corporation tax, the rate has changed so many times in the last few years, I have lost count. And the regimes for investment have also changed. And again, we've seen another change to R&D tax credits. I don't think the details are out yet. But this is unhelpful. Full expensing, a great thing. The right to do it, I would tweak it a bit, but it's the right thing to do. But really, business tax, this government and any next government, the best thing they could do is say, here is our business tax agenda. This is what we're doing. We are now not changing it at all for the next 5 years. And I think that would be welcomed by pretty much all businesses.
What about the personal taxation part of it as well? Because obviously politicians are very keen to try and be able to deliver something like the 2 percentage point reduction in national insurance for workers. But is there a question or a need for tax stability when it comes to personal tax?
I think that is less important. It's clearly not great to fiddle endlessly with the tax system, but I'm doubtful there are wider economic issues from changing national insurance here, there and everywhere, which is what's been going on. It's certainly confusing for people, and I don't imagine there's many people in the country who really know how their personal position has been changed by, first of all, the national insurance cut, but second, the much more significant fiscal drag you mentioned earlier, which I think amounts to about £50 billion overall in tax increases over the last couple of years. 50 billion, not a small number.
Yeah, you say that you're quite disappointed with what the Chancellor delivered. I mean, the constraints, though, the lack of economic growth in the UK means that Hunt is restricted, and a future government will be restricted because of the lack of kind of fiscal headroom. And also, I wonder how much you agree with the Institute for Government and the IFS, two significant think tanks, talking about how the tax cuts are not even sustainable. The IFS quite pointedly talking about it being implausible that the tax cuts would even be able to hold. Do you agree?
The disappointment to me isn't the lack of giveaways, because that clearly would not be responsible. It's the lack of looking at features of the tax system which hold back growth, which would not cost significant amounts of money, but which plausibly have a role in fixing the productivity puzzle. The fact that the UK's productivity has stalled over the last few years. And there are areas of the tax system, I mentioned income tax, another is VAT, where politicians should be looking very, very hard at these features and asking whether there are ways to solve them that don't cost money, which could boost economic growth.
So that was Dan Neidle there, the founder of Tax Policy Associates. Interesting that he mentioned lots of areas of our tax system that are stalling productivity. That was his big criticism. If you want people to get back to work, don't give them big disincentives around certain pinch points in the income tax brackets between sort of 50 and 60,000 and 100 and 120,000 pounds. That was his view, and stick to your tax policy over a sort of long period of time. So that was his conclusion.
Yeah, because there are loads of bumps in the tax system which people have been flagging, particularly the people like Dan Neidle, for a long time. As you say, the one at 50,000, the one at 100,000. The withdrawal of child benefit is a big problem for a lot of families now that when you earn £50,000, it's withdrawn quite rapidly. So that is a big disincentive to work, and these things have not been changed by successive governments.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so that's the autumn statement. But then, of course, all of this really superseded, I think, today, the positive headlines that seem to come out from that statement by the record on immigration, which has brought that issue into sharp focus. Net migration data released this week shows a near record number of long-term migrants coming to the UK in the year ending to June, a near record number also of long-term migrants. The previous data was also revised up heavily to a record 745,000 net arrivals in the year to December. So the issue of migration.
Yeah, of course, the Conservatives promised to crack down on the number of overseas arrivals coming to the UK after a desire to reduce migrant numbers fuelled the Brexit vote. Joe, I want to get your thoughts on this. How much of a problem is this for the government? They promised to get numbers down, and the numbers have gone very much in the other direction.
Yeah, I think it is a very big problem in that the Brexit vote and the 2019 general election, all those political moments were very much largely seen as moments where the country was pushing back on immigration. But then in that period for there to have been these effects of such large numbers coming in, that's something that will anger many, and indeed it could boost the potential electoral success of the Reform Party, for example. So the Conservatives have to be really careful that they don't lose ground on this issue, but those kind of numbers will inevitably fuel that kind of anger. So yeah, they have to be very careful.
Joe, there's been a lot of reports about the mood on the Tory backbenches when it comes to the subject of migration, ranging from angry to very angry. Do you think there's a sense that perhaps the government has focused too much on small boats, which is a relatively small number of people crossing the Channel, and they've sort of taken their eye off the ball when it comes to the bigger picture?
Yes, I think that's true. But there's also that question of how much does the government actually really mind about these high figures insofar as the economic benefit that obviously lots of these migrants brings, particularly in things like healthcare, social care. The large chunk of these numbers come from people coming in under government-sanctioned schemes, work visas, often non-EU workers. And so clearly there's a tension in government between the Treasury, Number 10, who have been happy to preside over this system, but then the Home Office wanting there to be strict controls.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to continue the conversation about migration. That was Joe Mays from our UK government team. And also joining us now is Madeleine Sumption, who is director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Perhaps to talk in more depth, actually, about these official numbers. They are ONS figures around migration. It looks like net migration into the UK has doubled since 2016. Madeleine, great to have you on Bloomberg UK Politics. Who are the people that are coming in? What are the main groups? What do we know? Because these numbers aren't that solid, are they? They are an estimate.
That's right. The most recent numbers are very much an estimate. They will be revised potentially substantially to just illustrate that. The numbers that we have for 2022 were revised up by almost 140,000. So, from the Office of National Statistics originally said it was 606,000. Now they're saying they believe it was actually closer to 745,000. As you get further from the date when the migration happened, the numbers get more accurate. In terms of who is coming in, the migration is driven effectively exclusively by people coming from outside of the EU. We've actually got negative net migration of EU citizens, so more EU citizens leaving the UK currently than arriving. And the main reasons for migration are, the biggest one was international students, people coming typically for master's programs. Then you have quite a lot of people coming in for work, and the biggest factor there is people coming in the health and care sector, and particularly care workers becoming in unusually large numbers as a result of a change in policy. We also have some people coming from Hong Kong and Ukraine under the humanitarian routes for those countries, but those numbers have dropped off in the most recent figures.
How far can we trust these ONS stats? Because as you mentioned, they are a survey, aren't they? And the latest revision we've had today was a massive change to the numbers from last year. So can we trust the veracity of these figures?
The most recent figure, so the net migration of 672,000, I would expect that to be revised. It could be revised potentially substantially. Easily we could see revisions in the tens of thousands. The Office of National Statistics said that perhaps it could be as low as in the 500,000s, or indeed in the 700s. So I think they really just give us an initial indication. The indication that we see, I think, is plausible, which is what they seem to be showing is that immigration or net migration has leveled off and is perhaps entering a downward trajectory. Now, while that's provisional, it is actually quite plausible, because one thing that my colleagues and I have been saying after looking at the numbers and doing some modelling is that we expect emigration to go up in the next 2 years as some of the international students who've been coming into the UK start to leave again. There'll be more international students, so more people leaving is what we expect. So that downward trajectory, that it's too early to say for sure, but it may well be that in the coming years we'll see more of that happening.
I wanted to ask you about students, actually. Some Tory MPs have called for students to be excluded from the migration statistics. How do you feel about that? Are we counting the right people?
I personally am not a fan of excluding the students from the net migration statistics on the basis that they are there, they are people, they exist. Many of them come for at least a year. Most of them probably now come for at least a year, which is what makes someone count as an international migrant under, well-recognized international definition. And so I think the Office of National Statistics can't just pretend that those people don't exist and that they're not part of the UK population. What they can do, and what they are now starting to do, is create alternative measures that allow people to see how different groups contribute, whether it's students or workers or family members. And I think what we will start to see is that actually students contribute in the long run to net migration much more than people have realised, because even if only a small share of them stay permanent in the UK, there are so many students that the sort of 20% or so who've been staying recently, that can actually make quite a contribution to the population in the long run.
We asked this of our UK politics correspondent that you might have heard just earlier, Joe Mays, on this issue. Does the public distinguish between the different types of migrants that come to the UK? I mean, there's been so much focus on one of the 5 big pledges that Rishi Sunak made to stop the boats, as he puts it. That's about kind of migration in a very a dangerous way of people desperately trying to get across the channel. That's a relatively small number of people compared to the other migration figures. Do you think the public gets any of the differences?
No, I don't think so. I think that, maybe they get some of the differences, but I think in general, when you survey people and ask them a question like, when you think of a migrant in the UK, who do you think of? People are much more likely to think about asylum seekers or people coming in small boats, for example. They are much less likely to say international students, even though international students are the biggest category of people coming in. And it's quite understandable that would be the case, because international students, even though they're really numerous, they don't get the same levels of press coverage, obviously, as people coming in to claim asylum. So I do think that there is a risk in this debate that people talk in general terms about migration, 1.2 million people immigrating to the UK, or 675,000 net migration, and that people hearing those numbers probably, many of them in their minds will be thinking about small boats, whereas actually, there are many different reasons that people come to the UK.
There have been suggestions about how we could tweak some of the routes that people come into the country. For instance, bringing students bringing their families with them. Some of these calls, particularly from Conservative backbenchers. What's your view on some of the ways that we could reduce the numbers if that's what we wanted to do?
Yeah, so there's no, from a sort of economics perspective, there's no optimal level of migration, but obviously politicians on both Labour and Conservative have said that they would like to reduce the numbers. So the question that they face, if that's their goal, is, okay, well, how do you reduce them in a way that that is not damaging for the UK? And I think I can see why the dependents of international students were targeted first, partly because there has been quite a large increase in the numbers of dependents, or family members, basically partners and children of students. We don't have a lot of evidence on what their impacts are, unfortunately, because most of the research was done at a time when this wasn't really a thing. People didn't tend to bring family members. I think it obviously will have an impact on, so we'll see fewer people coming in because those family members won't be there. We may also see fewer students coming in, because obviously there will be some students who don't want to come to the UK anymore if they can't bring their family members. But it's possible that universities will effectively recruit more vigorously elsewhere among groups of people who don't have family members, and try and make up the numbers, because universities effectively do see quite a big subsidy for their operations coming from international students, because they pay much higher fees than domestic students.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge issue for that sector. Look, you've also published a report why the latest net migration figures are not a reliable guide to future trends. I mean, I think that's also worth talking about. The rising figures, it's something that successive governments have had to deal with. And yet, actually, in some of your work, you've pointed to the fact that it's not a predictor of the future.
No, that's right. And what we did in that piece of work you've mentioned is we say, okay, let's say you have the high levels of immigration that we've seen recently. Let's say that continues. What happens to net migration? And net migration actually, if everything else stays the same, net migration tends to go down because basically you've got people coming in now in larger numbers. For example, international students who will, many of whom will go home. And so they'll basically subtract from the net migration figure in a few years' time. So all else equal, what we really expect is the numbers will come down even without policy changes. There are a couple of things that could throw that off course, though. And one of them is whether we continue to see increases in the number of people coming in to work, particularly in the health and care sector. And the other is whether international students start to stay in at higher rates, for example, because of the graduate route or because it's now easier for them to stay permanently if they can get a job in the care sector.
Madeleine, thanks so much for joining us. Madeleine Sumption, Director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Fascinating to get Madeleine's thoughts on that.
Yeah, how much pressure will the government be under on this migration issue? No doubt something will pick up for you next week. That's it from us for today, though. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Mariful Hussain. I'm Yuan Potts.
I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more next week. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.